symptoms of exhaustion are all over America. We live in a post-industrial age where technologies have allowed us to produce more than ever before. The rise in supply and demand means that our days are filled with more to do. If you've ever said, "I don't have time," you may have been bitten by the burnout bug. At first, we don't see any of the symptoms, but over time, they set in. Feverish activity, nausea over lack of results, a constant headache, and escapist behaviors like overeating, addiction, and withdrawal from relationships. Eventually, the bug drives us to bed rest, and we're no longer functional at all. Our overactivity and need to produce actually drive us to accomplish less and feel worse. No generation is as vulnerable to the burnout bug as the millennials. We were raised on technology and media devices. We're seeing the traditional workplace and work schedule dissolve and restructure. Today, in many of our jobs, we can work at any time and at any place, which means we're working all the time and everywhere. Our generation is reframing the rhythm of the week. But are we building something better or worse? Most millennials admit to a steady experience of stress and exhaustion. 25% of millennials say that they're mentally or physically overwhelmed more than 5 times a month. This means that at least one whole week of the month, or at least one day of every week, we feel overwhelmed. We feel like the tank is half full or the battery is in the red. Where do we fill up and recharge in this 24/7, 365 world of production? If millennials were an American city, we'd be New York, the generation that never sleeps. So let me ask a question that will reveal whether or not you've been bitten by the bug. When you plan your day or your week, is rest the first or the last thing you schedule? If it's first, then keep on keeping on. But if it's last or you never think about actually scheduling rest, then stay with us for the next few minutes. The creation story in Genesis 1 and 2 tells us that humans are created to rest before we produce. The truth of our human condition is that all of us operate best from a place of rest. In Genesis 1, we see a flurry of creative activity as God speaks into existence things that did not previously exist. He brings light into darkness, order out of the chaos, and he defines the parameters in which humanity exists. God spends 6 days speaking, ordering, defining, and harmonizing his creation. And on the 6th day, he gets down into the mess and mud of the earth to create a being in whom he can delight. He forms man out of the dust of the earth and then forms woman from the flesh of the man. Together, they represent the image of God and the culmination of his creative work, male and female, masculine and feminine, man and woman. God looked upon all that he had created and he determined that it was very good. Genesis 2 reveals that God had finished his work. On day 7, he set aside a day to rest. In fact, the only activity that God took on that day was to bless that day to be unlike the other 6. God took a day just so he could delight in all that he had made. What's interesting to me in this narrative of our human history is that day 7 in creation is the first full day in which man and woman existed, which means that our first and primary activity every week is to rest in the blessing of a God who delights in us. Day 7 to God is day 1 to us. Dr. Matthew Sleeth in his book 24/6 talks about how the post-industrial Western world has waged a war on the weekly day of rest. The majority of human history included a weekly break from work, but in the last few decades, the American culture has neglected this creation rhythm. Sleeth suggests that our production-oriented world will turn us into human doings rather than human beings. He says that it's imperative to our health and our productivity that we start our weeks from a state of rest. So I ask again, is rest the first or the last thing that you schedule? If it's last, you're not alone. In fact, the people of God have constantly struggled to maintain the priority of rest. When Moses reveals the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20, God had to set in stone that the 4th command would be to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. He tells the people that they'll work for 6 days and complete all of their work in those 6 days so that he can have their primary attention on the 7th day. This command is a gift of grace to keep the people of God from forgetting their Creator and their Rescuer. But like most gracious commands, we think we know better. The prophets like Ezekiel, they tell us that the people of God regularly decided to reject this command. They, like we still do today, they took the word of the Lord to be more of a suggestion than an imperative. Ezekiel 20 tells us that God gave the people the Sabbath as a sign, so that they would know that their relationship to the Creator and Rescuer, not their productivity, is what set them apart. Outside of this relationship, there's nothing but the stress, pain, and exhaustion of living for the sake of producing. Isaiah also weighed in on this rejection of rest, and he begged the people of God to turn back to Sabbath keeping in Isaiah 58. He reminded them that God would be gracious if they would turn away from doing their own things, trying to make their own happiness, trying to build up their own businesses. When we do these things, we give ourselves over to boundaryless work days and never-ending work weeks. Isaiah says that if we would reclaim the centrality of rest, we would find a new source of delight. He gives the image of rest as a pampering, a refreshing. The Sabbath, when entered into with a pure heart, is like a spiritual pedicure for battle-worn souls. The New Testament tells us that people didn't see rest this way even during Jesus' time. Jesus had to talk with the people of God about their abusing and misunderstanding of the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus reminds humanity that the seventh day was created for man. Man was not created for the seventh day. Many of Jesus' teachings and healings happen on the day of rest within the context of local synagogues. People took issue with this, but some of God's most significant and clearly identifiable activity occurs when we set our work aside and rest with Him. More than His teachings and miracles, Jesus Himself showed us what daily and weekly rest looks like. As a human, He knew that He needed to sleep. In fact, one detail often goes overlooked in one of His most famous stories. Before Jesus comes to the aid of the disciples to calm the sea, the scripture says that He was beneath the deck sleeping, even when the storms are raging. Maybe even more so when the storms are raging. We need rest. Some of us are so used to neglecting sleep that we no longer believe we even need it. But if the God of the universe made a point to sleep, I think we ought to do the same. Jesus also shows us what it looks like to practice a day of rest each week. As a Jewish custom, He regularly stopped every Sabbath from His carpentry to attend the synagogue. He continued this practice even after entering into full-time proclamation of His gospel. I think Jesus knew that in addition to daily sleep, we need a weekly time to embrace our identity as the community of God. Collectively, we all acknowledge once a week that God is our Creator and our Rescuer, and that He takes priority over all the work we do. All of our weekly activity finds its proper place in relation to the priority of God. He is our day one priority, and the other 6 days happen in response to Him. Today, the church still practices daily and weekly rest. We still follow Jesus' example by going to bed every night and gathering for church every week. Some of the most profound experiences of God are born out of rest. It is amazing how clearly God can speak to us when the noise and busyness of our lives is silenced and slowed down. When we are rested, we're more attuned to hear the echoes of the garden from which we've migrated. When we're rested, we are able to remember the one who sanctifies and delights in us. When we are rested, we acknowledge that we are neither our Creator nor our own Rescuer. I hear a lot of millennials saying that they struggle to hear from God regarding their lives. I wonder if it's our pace that keeps us from discovering and living His will. I wonder if we adjusted our schedules to include adequate sleep each day and a communal experience of grace each week, if we would find the voice of God much easier to hear. I know that when I start my day rested and my week from a state of rest, my life is far more fulfilling and, not ironically, far more productive. The Jesus-following, Spirit-empowered, God-honoring life is lived in a soul at rest. So take a break every week, get some sleep every night, and engage everyday activities from a place of rest.